Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R Tolkien. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Before diving into The Fellowship of the Ring, it's important to understand its origins. This epic tale is the direct sequel to The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien's beloved adventure novel about Bilbo Baggins, a reluctant hobbit who stumbles into a world of danger, dragons, and treasure. At the end of The Hobbit, Bilbo acquires a strange, magical ring, seemingly insignificant at the time, but destined to change the fate of Middle-earth. The Lord of the Rings picks up decades later, revealing that this ring is none other than the One Ring, the key to the Dark Lord Sauron's power. What begins as a simple journey soon unfolds into a grand and perilous quest, far greater than Bilbo could have ever imagined. Despite its literary acclaim, The Lord of the Rings has faced its share of controversy. Surprisingly, it was once banned in Mexico, not for political or religious reasons, but due to misinterpretation. Some authorities mistakenly viewed it as promoting witchcraft and occultism, leading to temporary restrictions on its availability. However, over time, the novel's true nature as a deeply philosophical work about courage, friendship, and the struggle between good and evil was recognized, and its reputation as one of the greatest fantasy epics of all time remained untarnished. Now, let's begin the journey. In the quiet, green lands of the Shire, where rolling hills stretched beneath a vast, peaceful sky, a peculiar tale was about to unfold, one that would shake the foundations of Middle-earth. It began, as many stories do, with a birthday. But this was no ordinary birthday, for it marked the 111st year of Bilbo Baggins, the eccentric yet wealthy hobbit who had once disappeared on an adventure and returned with stories of dragons and treasure. The people of Hobbiton regarded him with both admiration and suspicion. For though he had grown old, he remained unchanged, his youthful energy defying the passage of years. Bilbo, however, had plans for this particular birthday, plans that would astonish his guests and change the course of history. He had grown weary of the Shire, of its simple comforts and idle chatter, and longed for adventure once more. His great party, an event of unparalleled splendor, was his farewell. The party field was adorned with lanterns and filled with tables overflowing with food and drink. Fireworks, crafted by none other than Gandalf the Grey, a wizard of long acquaintance, lit up the night, dazzling the gathered hobbits. As the festivities reached their peak, Bilbo stood before the crowd, raising his glass for a speech. "I don't know half of you half as well as I should like," he said with a twinkle in his eye, "and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve." Laughter rippled through the audience, though some exchanged puzzled glances. Then, with a final mischievous smile, Bilbo uttered his last words. "I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye." And with that, he vanished. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Panic set in. But Bilbo was nowhere to be seen, for he had slipped the One Ring onto his finger, a small golden band that he had carried since his adventure with Thorin and company. Invisible to all, he hurried back to Bag End, where Gandalf awaited him. In the quiet of his study, Bilbo removed the ring, revealing himself once more. He sighed, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I am leaving everything to Frodo," he said, speaking of his young cousin and heir, Frodo Baggins, whom he loved dearly. But when Gandalf pressed him to leave the ring behind, Bilbo hesitated. His fingers lingered over it, his expression troubled. "It is mine," he muttered, his voice taking on an edge of possessiveness. The wizard's keen eyes darkened. "You have had it long enough," Gandalf warned. For a moment, a terrible struggle played out within Bilbo. Then, with a deep breath, he let out a shaky laugh and dropped the ring onto the floor. "I suppose you're right," he said. "After all, why should I want to keep it?" But Gandalf did not laugh. As Bilbo walked out of Bag End for the last time, vanishing into the night on his way to Rivendell, the wizard turned to the small golden ring that lay on the ground. He had long suspected it was no ordinary trinket, and now his fears deepened. With Bilbo gone, Frodo Baggins inherited Bag End and the ring. The years passed peacefully, with Frodo living a quiet life among his friends, including the ever-loyal Samwise Gamgee. But Gandalf did not forget the ring, and his concerns only grew. He left the Shire, seeking knowledge in the distant corners of Middle-earth, delving into ancient scrolls and whispering tales of shadow and fire. And at last, his worst fears were confirmed. The ring was the One Ring, the Master Ring of Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor. Forged in the fires of Mount Doom, it was no mere trinket, but a relic of terrible power capable of bending the will of its bearer, of twisting even the strongest of hearts. Sauron, long thought defeated, had risen once more, and he sought the ring with all his malice. Should he reclaim it, Middle-earth would fall into eternal darkness. Rushing back to the Shire, Gandalf arrived at Bag End with urgency. He found Frodo and, without delay, revealed the terrible truth. "You are in danger," the wizard warned. "The ring must leave the Shire." Frodo was stunned. His peaceful life had been shattered in an instant. But before he could ask more, Gandalf gave him an even greater shock. "We must test the ring," he said. And with that, he threw it into the fireplace. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faint letters appeared, glowing like embers on the surface of the gold. In the black speech of Mordor, they read, "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them." Frodo trembled. The truth was undeniable. "We must take it far away," Gandalf continued. "If Sauron's servants find it here, they will show no mercy." Frodo, overwhelmed, struggled to speak. Then, "I will take it away," he said at last. "I will leave the Shire." Gandalf nodded, but his eyes were shadowed with worry. "Good, but you must not go alone." Samwise Gamgee, who had been eavesdropping by the window, was quickly discovered. At first, he was terrified what punishment would the great wizard lay upon him. But instead, Gandalf gave him a different command. "You shall go with Frodo," he declared. And so, a journey began not for glory, nor for treasure, but to protect the world from a darkness beyond imagining. Yet danger had already found them. Far to the south in the land of Mordor, the Dark Lord's servants had awoken. The Ringwraiths, the Nazgul, once kings of men who had fallen under Sauron's power, rode forth, cloaked in black. Their mission was clear: find the ring, kill the one who carried it. As Frodo and Sam prepared for their departure, unaware of the shadows closing in, the Shire, so full of light, laughter, and green hills, was about to fade behind them. The road ahead would be perilous, and neither hobbit could yet fathom how far their journey would take them. Thus began the great tale of the Fellowship of the Ring, a journey that would cross mountains, forests, and the very heart of darkness itself. The road out of the Shire was a quiet one, winding through familiar fields and hedgerows. But to Frodo Baggins, it felt as though he were stepping into another world. With Samwise Gamgee by his side, he tried to keep his mind on the task ahead, but an unease lingered in his heart. Gandalf had given him dire warnings, and though he did not yet know what lay beyond the borders of his homeland, he could not shake the feeling that something or someone was already searching for him. At first, their departure was slow and cautious. Frodo did not wish to attract attention, so he maintained the appearance of an ordinary hobbit going about his business. He had told the folk of Hobbiton that he was moving to a small house in Crickhollow, near Buckland, a reasonable distance away, but still within the Shire. Few questioned it, though his cousins, Merry Brandabuck and Pippin Took, were suspicious of his secrecy. But danger was already upon them. As they traveled the back roads, Sam suddenly tugged at Frodo's sleeve. "Listen," he whispered. In the distance, hoofbeats echoed through the trees. A rider was approaching. They quickly darted off the path, crouching behind thick roots as the sound drew nearer. Then, from the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged. A great black horse stepped onto the path, its rider clad in a dark cloak. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but the air around it felt heavy with malice. The creature, whoever it was, paused as if sniffing the air, searching for something unseen. Frodo felt a strange pull inside him, an urge to slip the ring onto his finger. His hand moved involuntarily toward his pocket, but Sam, sensing something was wrong, gripped his arm. After a long, tense moment, the rider let out a slow, rattling breath and spurred his horse forward, disappearing into the darkness ahead. Frodo let out a shaky sigh. "That was no ordinary traveler," he murmured. Sam nodded. "And I reckon it was looking for you, Mr. Frodo." With no time to lose, they pressed on toward Buckland, avoiding the main roads where they could. Along the way, they were joined by Merry and Pippin, who had guessed that Frodo was up to something far more important than a simple move to Crickhollow. Instead of arguing, they insisted on coming along. "You don't know the way through the old forest like I do," Merry said with a grin. "Besides, you'll need more than just Sam to keep you out of trouble." Frodo could not argue with that. Reaching Buckland under the cover of night, they settled briefly at Crickhollow, but their rest was short-lived. The Black Riders, who Frodo now understood to be the Nazgul, servants of the Dark Lord, were searching for him. A sense of urgency filled the air. They could not stay. To avoid pursuit, they decided to take an unconventional route through the old forest, a dense, tangled woodland that had long held an eerie reputation among the hobbits. Many who entered it found themselves lost, as if the trees themselves wished to confuse and entrap travelers. But Merry, a Brandabuck of Buckland, knew of paths that might offer them safe passage. Yet the forest was alive in ways that none of them fully understood. The air was thick with an ancient, lingering malice. The trees seemed to shift and whisper, branches closing in as they moved. The deeper they went, the more disoriented they became, as if the land itself sought to turn them around. And then, to their horror, they stumbled upon something far worse than twisted paths: Old Man Willow. A towering, gnarled willow tree stood at the heart of the forest, its roots sprawling like the tentacles of some ancient beast. Wearied from their journey, the hobbits, against their better judgment, rested against its great trunk. In an instant, the tree attacked. Pippin and Merry were seized, swallowed into the crevices of the bark, while Frodo was thrown into the water of a nearby stream by an unseen force. As he struggled, Sam fought against the grip of the tree, but his small blade was useless against its ancient power. Despair gripped them. There seemed to be no escape. Then, from the distance, a voice rose in song. A strange figure approached, his bright blue coat swaying with each step, his yellow boots gleaming in the filtered sunlight. He was a peculiar sight, a man, yet unlike any they had seen before. He had a long, bushy beard and twinkling eyes, and he moved with an ease that suggested he feared nothing in the world. "Hey doll, merry doll, ring a dong dillo," he sang. The sound of his voice alone sent shivers through the air. The tree trembled, its grip loosened. And with a great groaning sigh, it released Merry and Pippin, who tumbled to the ground, gasping for breath. The stranger laughed. Old Man Willow does not love strangers, that much is certain. Frodo, still shaken, looked up at their rescuer. Who are you?" "Tom Bombadil at your service," the man declared with a flourishing bow. "Master of wood, water, and hill. And you, my little friends, are far from home." There was something about Tom Bombadil, something ageless, untouched by the darkness that loomed over Middle-earth. He seemed both wise and foolish, powerful and playful, a being apart from all others. He took them to his house, where they met Goldberry, his fair and enchanting wife, who greeted them with warmth and kindness. In the safety of Bombadil's home, the shadows of the world seemed to fade, if only for a little while. But though they had found refuge, their journey was far from over. Bombadil warned them of dangers ahead, of the Barrow Downs, a place of ancient tombs and lingering spirits. And true to his warning, as they left his domain, they soon found themselves ensnared once more. A cold mist rolled over the downs, shrouding the land in ghostly white. Shadows loomed among the burial mounds, and an unnatural stillness settled over them. Before they realized their mistake, they had wandered into a barrow, trapped within the darkness of an ancient grave. Cold fingers closed around Frodo's wrist. The weight of centuries pressed down on him as a whispering voice filled the air. Cold be hand and heart and bone, and cold be sleep under stone. Panic gripped him. He could not see his friends. He could barely breathe. But then a memory surfaced, Tom Bombadil's words. In his final moments of strength, Frodo called out, "Ho, Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil, come to me." And just as before, the voice of the strange wanderer came, singing through the night. The wraiths of the barrow recoiled in terror, their ancient spell broken. Light flooded the tomb as Bombadil strode inside, sweeping away the darkness with his mere presence. Once more, he had saved them. And as they stepped into the fresh air, shaken but alive, they knew the road ahead would only grow darker. The Black Riders still hunted them. They had lost precious time. And somewhere beyond the borders of the Shire, the weight of the world's fate was waiting for them to bear. Thus, the journey pressed on toward Bree, where Gandalf had once promised to meet them. But whether he would be waiting, or whether an even greater danger lay ahead, they did not yet know. As the four hobbits emerged from the eerie mists of the Barrow Downs, shaken but alive, they knew they had no time to waste. The encounter with the Barrow Wights had been terrifying, but thanks to Tom Bombadil's intervention, they had survived. Now, their journey led them to Bree, a town unlike any they had ever known. It was a place where men and hobbits lived together, where news from the outside world traveled swiftly, and where, if they were fortunate, they would find Gandalf waiting for them. As they approached the gates of Bree, the sight of the great hedge that encircled the town filled them with an odd sense of unease. The Shire had been open, free, untouched by the worries of the wider world, but Bree was different. The watchful eyes of men guarded its entrances, and strangers passed through its streets. For hobbits accustomed to their quiet, predictable lives, it was a reminder that they had truly stepped beyond the borders of home. A gatekeeper peered at them suspiciously as they knocked. "What's your business in Bree?" he asked, eyeing them up and down. "We're travelers," Frodo said carefully, "looking for lodging at the Prancing Pony." The gatekeeper hesitated, but eventually allowed them entry. "Keep your wits about you," he muttered. "Strange folk about these days." Inside the town, the streets were lined with wooden houses and flickering lanterns, the sound of voices and laughter spilling from tavern doors. Unlike Hobbiton, where everyone knew everyone, Bree was a crossroads of Middle-earth, a place where merchants, wanderers, and even outlaws might pass unnoticed. As they made their way to the Prancing Pony, they felt the weight of many unfamiliar eyes upon them. The Prancing Pony was a lively inn, filled with the scent of ale and pipe smoke, with a roaring fire at its heart. The innkeeper, Barlaman Butterbur, bustled about, tending to his guests. He was a stout, forgetful man, but friendly enough, and he welcomed the hobbits with good-natured chatter. "You'll be wanting rooms, then?" he asked, wiping his hands on his apron. "And maybe a bit of supper. We've got a fine stew tonight." Frodo nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "Has Gandalf been through here?" he asked. Butterbur frowned. "Gandalf? Now that's a name I haven't heard in a few weeks. Said he had important business. Told me to keep an eye out for some travelers, come to think of it. But now, where did I put that note?" He scratched his head in frustration. "Must be around here somewhere." A sinking feeling settled in Frodo's stomach. Gandalf was not here. And if he was not here, then something had delayed him. They took a corner table, hoping to remain unnoticed. But in a place like the Prancing Pony, new arrivals always drew curiosity. Bree was full of talk about troubles in the east, strange sightings on the roads, and whispers of a growing shadow. Among the tavern's patrons were men from the south, rangers who kept their distance, and even a few hobbits from Bree. It was one of these Bree hobbits, a fellow named Nob, who first pointed out a mysterious figure seated alone in the shadows. "That's Strider," Nob muttered. "A ranger. Bit of a strange one, but the innkeeper trusts him well enough." Frodo followed Nob's gaze and saw a man seated against the far wall, his cloak drawn about him, his face hidden beneath a hood. He was tall, weathered, and his keen eyes flickered toward Frodo more than once. There was something unsettling about him, something watchful. As the night wore on, the hobbits, eager to lighten the mood, encouraged Frodo to entertain the crowd. Reluctantly, he climbed atop a table and began to sing a merry tune about a foolish hobbit who tumbled into a river. Laughter erupted, but as he moved to bow, he lost his footing. Instinctively, his hand went to his pocket, and in an instant, the world seemed to shift. Gasps filled the room. The laughter ceased. Where Frodo had been standing, there was now nothing. He had vanished. Panic shot through him as he realized his mistake. The ring had slipped onto his finger. At once, the world changed, sounds became distant, the room grew dim, and a shadow loomed in the corners of his vision. He felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, searching, reaching. With all his will, he yanked the ring from his finger and stumbled back into the light. The room was silent. Suspicion hung in the air. He had made a grave error. Before he could explain himself, Strider was at his side, gripping his arm. "You must come with me," the ranger whispered. Now, Frodo hesitated, but the intensity in Strider's gaze left no room for argument. The man led him swiftly upstairs, away from prying eyes. The rest of the hobbits followed, confusion and worry etched upon their faces. Inside their room, Strider threw back his hood, revealing a face worn by years of hardship, but noble and sharp. "You are in danger," he said gravely. "The Black Riders are close." Frodo stiffened. "Who are you?" Strider's eyes did not waver. "I am a friend. My name is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. I have been watching you because you are being hunted. The enemy knows the ring is near." The room fell into silence. Frodo's mind raced. Could they trust this man? He knew of the riders, he knew of the ring. How? And yet, there was something in Strider's voice that spoke of urgency, of truth. "I can take you safely from Bree," Aragorn continued, "but we must leave at once." Before they could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Butterbur, looking flustered. In his hand was a crumpled piece of parchment. "I found it," he panted. "The note from Gandalf." Frodo snatched it quickly and read, "Make haste. Do not wait. If I am not there, trust the man called Strider. He is a friend." Frodo's heart pounded. Gandalf had known this would happen. He had known they would need Aragorn's help. There was no time to waste. That night, while the rest of the inn slept, the hobbits and Aragorn slipped out through a back door, disappearing into the darkness. And none too soon, for as they left Bree behind, shadowed figures crept into the prancing pony. The Black Riders had arrived, but their prey was already gone. The journey was growing darker, more perilous with every step. They had left the comforts of home far behind, and the road ahead would only grow more treacherous. Yet now, with Aragorn as their guide, there was still a chance, a slim, fleeting hope that they might reach Rivendell before it was too late. Under the cover of darkness, Frodo and his companions left Bree behind, following Aragorn along an unmarked path that wound its way into the wild. Behind them, the town lay in uneasy silence, unaware of the danger that had nearly befallen it. The Black Riders had come, but the hobbits were already gone. The journey ahead would not be an easy one. Aragorn led them away from the main road, taking them through rough country where the hills rolled in endless waves of grass and rock. "We cannot risk the east road," he explained. "The riders will be watching it." Instead, they traveled by hidden paths, moving through the wild lands that stretched between Bree and the distant valley of Rivendell. At first, the hobbits struggled to keep pace. Aragorn walked with the endurance of a seasoned traveler, his stride swift and sure, while the hobbits, though sturdy, were unused to such long marches. But they had little choice. Each day the land grew lonelier, and the fear of pursuit loomed over them. The Black Riders were somewhere behind, unseen but never far. They camped in secret places, lighting no fires, eating only what they carried. The land was growing colder, and as they climbed into the hills, a harsh wind blew through the valleys. Yet Aragorn remained unshaken. He seemed to know every rock and tree, every hidden hollow where they could rest unseen. At night, while the others slept fitfully, he kept watch, listening for sounds on the wind. Despite the danger, Aragorn did not let them lose hope. He spoke to them of Rivendell, of the House of Elrond, where wisdom and ancient power still dwelled. "If we reach Rivendell, you will be safe," he told Frodo. "There, the power of the enemy does not hold sway." But Rivendell was still far away, and Frodo was growing weaker. At first, he did his best to hide it. The wound in his shoulder where the Black Rider had stabbed him on Weathertop, had seemed small at first, only a cold ache beneath his cloak. But as the days passed, the cold deepened. A shadow crept into his heart, and his steps became slow and heavy. Sam noticed first. "You're not well, Mr. Frodo," he said one evening as they made camp beneath a thicket of trees. "You've been looking pale, and you hardly touch your food." Frodo forced a smile. "I'm just tired, Sam." But Aragorn had already seen the truth. He knelt beside Frodo, pulling back his cloak to examine the wound. His face darkened. "This is worse than I feared," he murmured. "The blade that struck you was no ordinary weapon." The others gathered around, worry etched on their faces. "It was a Morgul blade," Aragorn explained grimly. "A weapon of the enemy, forged in sorcery. If the wound is not treated, the poison will spread. It is trying to turn you into a wraith." A chill passed through them. "What can we do?" Sam asked, his voice urgent. "We must reach Rivendell," Aragorn said. "Only Elrond can heal this wound." The urgency of their journey deepened. Now they were not only fleeing the Black Riders, but racing against the slow poison that crept through Frodo's veins. They pushed forward, crossing into a landscape of rolling hills and tangled woods. But as they neared the river Bruinen, the last great barrier before Rivendell, their luck ran out. The Black Riders found them. It was in the valley beyond the river, as they hurried toward the ford of Bruinen, that the pursuit reached its climax. A terrible cry echoed behind them, cold and piercing, like the wail of death itself. They turned to see black figures emerging from the trees, their cloaks flowing like shadows against the earth. "Ride," Aragorn shouted. "Ride for the river." Frodo was too weak to walk, let alone run. He was lifted onto the back of a small, swift horse Glorfindel's gift to aid their flight. With the last of his strength, Frodo clung to the reins as the horse leaped forward, galloping toward the ford. The riders followed. Behind him, the sound of pounding hooves filled the air. The 9 were closing in, their dark forms gliding over the earth, their will pressing down upon him. Frodo's head swam with pain, his vision blurred, but still, he urged the horse onward. The river came into view. The ford of Bruinen. Safety lay just beyond it. As the horse plunged into the rushing water, Frodo turned back, summoning what little courage remained in him. The riders had halted at the edge of the river, their dark forms shifting as if hesitant to cross. Frodo gripped the hilt of his sword, his voice weak but defiant. "You shall not have the ring," he cried. A terrible laughter rose among the riders. The leader, taller and more terrible than the rest, raised a gauntleted hand. Slowly, he began to cross. The others followed. Then, the river roared. A mighty flood surged down from the mountains, crashing through the valley like a wall of silver and white. The waters rose in fury, sweeping over the riders. Their screams filled the air as they were pulled under, their dark forms swallowed by the torrent. The river had come alive, a wrathful force sent to destroy them. Frodo barely saw it. His strength was gone. As the last of the riders vanished beneath the waves, darkness took him, and he knew no more. He awoke to soft voices and the scent of fresh air. He was lying in a great room, sunlight filtering through high windows. A familiar face leaned over him, Gandalf. "You are in Rivendell," the wizard said gently. "You are safe." Frodo let out a long breath, safe, at last. But he knew deep in his heart that the journey was far from over. Frodo awoke in a soft bed, surrounded by golden light. For a moment, he thought he was back in the Shire, waking from a strange dream. But as his vision cleared, he saw high arching windows, carved wooden beams, and the gentle sound of water flowing beyond the walls. He was not in Bag End. He was in Rivendell. A familiar voice spoke beside him. "Well, my dear hobbit, you've given us quite a scare." Frodo turned his head and saw Gandalf sitting in a chair near the bedside, his old eyes filled with relief. "You are lucky to be alive," Gandalf said, leaning forward. "That wound nearly claimed you, had we been even a little later." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But Elrond is a great healer. You have been in his care for many days." The memory of their flight through the wilderness came back to Frodo. The riders, the river, the terrible weight of darkness pressing on his mind. He touched his shoulder, feeling a dull ache where the Morgul blade had pierced him. The wound was healed, yet a strange coldness lingered there. Gandalf seemed to understand his unspoken thoughts. "It will never fully fade," he said. "The blade was not of this world. Its shadow will remain with you." Frodo nodded, though he did not yet fully grasp the meaning of the wizard's words. A great joy filled the room as Sam, Merry, and Pippin burst in, their faces alight with relief. Sam, in particular, looked as though he had been worrying himself sick. "Oh, Mr. Frodo, you're awake. I knew you'd come round, but that was a close one." Merry and Pippin both embraced him, their chatter filling the room. Frodo could see in their eyes that they had feared for him, and he was grateful beyond words that they had made it to Rivendell together. In the days that followed, Frodo recovered under the care of the elves. He was given fresh clothes and warm meals, and though his body was still weak, his spirit grew lighter with each passing day. Rivendell was a place of timeless beauty, where waterfalls flowed like silver ribbons and elven voices filled the air with song. The trees stood tall and ageless, their golden leaves rustling in the gentle wind. It was unlike any place Frodo had ever seen, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe they had reached the end of their troubles. But deep inside, he knew the journey was far from over. On a cool autumn evening, Elrond called a great council. It was to be a meeting of many free peoples, elves, dwarves, men, and others who had come from distant lands. Though the hobbits did not know it yet, the fate of Middle-earth would be decided in that gathering. Elrond himself was a figure of great wisdom and power. His presence was strong yet kind, and when he spoke, the room fell silent. "You have been brought here because a great decision must be made," he said. "The shadow in the east is growing, and the enemy seeks to reclaim what was once his." Then Boromir, a man of Gondor, stood. "I have traveled from my city, Minas Tirith, seeking aid," he said. "Strange dreams have come to me, speaking of a weapon that could turn the tide of war, a sword that was broken, a halfling bearing a great doom." His gaze fell on Frodo. "And here sits a halfling with a secret we must all hear." At last, all eyes turned to Frodo. Slowly, hesitantly, he placed the ring upon the table. The golden band gleamed in the firelight, small and unassuming, yet it cast a shadow larger than any present could comprehend. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, murmurs of recognition. "This is the One Ring," Elrond confirmed. "The ring of power forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom." The weight of the revelation settled upon them all. The ring was no mere trinket. It was a weapon of terrible power, one that could turn the tide of war for good or for evil. If Sauron reclaimed it, Middle-earth would fall into darkness. Then, the voices rose in argument. Some, like Boromir, suggested using the ring as a weapon against the enemy. "Why not wield it against Sauron?" he asked. "With such a power, we could defeat him." But others, including Gandalf and Elrond, knew the truth. The ring could not be used for good. It would corrupt anyone who tried to wield it. Even the wise and the strong would fall to its influence. The only hope was to destroy it. But how? Someone asked. How can such a thing be unmade? There is only one way, Elrond said gravely. The ring must be cast into the fires of Mount Doom, where it was forged. A hush fell over the council. It was a near impossible task. Mordor was the heart of the enemy's power, and Mount Doom lay at its center, guarded by countless foes. A voice broke the silence. I will take the ring, Frodo said. His own words surprised him, yet as soon as he spoke them, he knew them to be true. Though I do not know the way. The council stirred. Here was a hobbit, small and unassuming, yet willing to take upon himself the greatest burden of all. Gandalf's eyes met Frodo's, filled with both pride and sorrow. I will help you bear this burden, he said, as long as it is yours to bear. Then Aragorn stepped forward. If by my life or death I can protect you, I will. He knelt before Frodo. You have my sword. And my bow, said Legolas, the elven prince of Mirkwood. And my axe, added Gimli, the dwarf, his voice firm. Boromir hesitated, then nodded. If this is the road we must take, then Gondor will see it done. At last, Sam pushed forward, his face set with determination. If Mr. Frodo's not going alone, then neither am I. Merry and Pippin exchanged a glance, then stood as well. We're coming too, said Merry. You'll have to tie us up in a sack to stop us. Elrond looked at them all, his expression unreadable. At last he spoke. So be it. You shall be the Fellowship of the Ring. The decision was made. They would leave Rivendell together, bound not by blood but by a shared purpose. 9 companions setting out toward the heart of darkness. Ahead of them lay countless dangers. Ahead of them lay the fires of Mordor. But for now, they stood together. And the journey of the Fellowship had begun. The morning of their departure from Rivendell was crisp and clear, with frost lingering on the ground like a thin veil of silver. The 9 companions, now known as the Fellowship of the Ring, gathered in the courtyard, preparing for the long road ahead. Each had been outfitted with supplies and sturdy cloaks woven by the elves, light yet warm. Frodo, at the heart of the company, bore the greatest burden of all, yet he felt strangely at peace. The fear that had gripped him in the days following the council had lessened, replaced by a quiet resolve. Elrond stood before them, his gaze solemn. The ring-bearer is setting out on the most perilous of roads, he said. You who travel with him must understand that this is no simple journey. You have little hope of returning, but if you hold true to each other, you may yet accomplish what seems impossible. He turned to Frodo. Your path is your own, Frodo. Even among your companions, the final choice will rest with you. With that, the Fellowship set out. Their course was uncertain, but their first goal was clear: to cross the misty mountains and reach the lands beyond. The straightest road would have taken them through the Gap of Rohan, but Gandalf knew that way was too closely watched. Instead, they would take the old paths through the mountains, though danger lurked there as well. The journey through the wild lands beyond Rivendell was slow and cautious. The Fellowship traveled by day, moving through rocky valleys and dense thickets, always wary of being followed. Aragorn, as their guide, led them on hidden paths that few outside the rangers of the North knew. The company moved in single file, often silent, their breath visible in the cold winter air. At night, they made camp in sheltered places, lighting small, smokeless fires. They spoke little of what lay ahead, but the weight of the journey pressed upon them all. Frodo, though well recovered, felt the presence of the ring growing heavier with each passing day. Even when it lay hidden beneath his tunic, he could feel its cold pull. whispering to him in the quiet hours. It was during one of these long nights that Boromir, the warrior of Gondor, sat beside Frodo and studied him carefully. "You carry a great burden, little one," he said. "I do not envy you." His eyes flickered toward Frodo's chest, where the ring lay hidden. "I wonder, have you ever considered that we might use it? Why not wield the enemy's weapon against him?" Frodo tensed. He had heard this argument before. "The ring cannot be used for good," he said. "Gandalf and Elrond have said so." Boromir frowned, but said no more that night. Still, Frodo could sense that the man of Gondor was troubled. As they pressed deeper into the wilderness, the land grew harsher. The hills became steeper, the wind colder. Soon, they reached the foothills of the Misty Mountains, and the first true test of their journey began. The Fellowship attempted to cross the mountains by the high pass of Caradhras, an ancient and treacherous route. They climbed for days, their feet slipping on icy stones, their breath stolen by the biting wind. The higher they went, the worse the weather became. Snow began to fall not softly, but in great blinding waves. It was unnatural, as if the mountain itself were resisting them. One night, as they huddled in a shallow cave, Gandalf's voice carried over the wind. "There is a malice in this storm," he said. "Caradhras does not welcome us." Indeed, it did not. The snow fell heavier, burying the path, and soon the way was impassable. The hobbits struggled against the drifts, but even Boromir and Aragorn, strong as they were, could barely force a path through. It became clear that they could go no further. "We must turn back," Aragorn said grimly. "But where will we go?" asked Legolas. "The road south is watched." Gandalf sighed, his face lined with thought. "There is another way," he said, "the Mines of Moria." At the name, a shadow passed over the company. Even Gandalf seemed reluctant to speak of it further. Gimli, however, lifted his head with interest. "The mines of my kin," he said, "tore out elf. A great city of old." Aragorn's voice was grim. "Moria is a place of darkness now. We do not know what we will find there." But they had little choice. The storm on Caradhras would not relent, and time was slipping away. At last, the decision was made. They would take the road beneath the mountains. 2 days later, they stood before the doors of Durin, the ancient western entrance to the mines of Moria. The doors were tall and set into the sheer rock face, engraved with delicate silver runes that shimmered in the moonlight. Gandalf traced the markings with his fingers. "Speak, friend, and enter," he murmured, reading the inscription. But the doors remained shut. For hours, Gandalf tried different words of power, muttering spells in the ancient tongues of men, elves, and dwarves. The doors did not budge. The Fellowship grew restless, and the night deepened. Frodo sat beside Sam, who glanced nervously at the dark waters of a nearby pool. "There's something unnatural about this place," Sam muttered. "I don't like it," Frodo agreed, and his unease soon proved warranted. As they waited, a ripple disturbed the surface of the water. Then another. Something was moving beneath the black depths. Suddenly, a great tentacled creature surged out of the pool, the Watcher in the water. It moved with terrifying speed, its writhing limbs lashing toward Frodo. The hobbit barely had time to cry out before he was seized, pulled toward the pool's edge. Sam and Aragorn sprang into action, hacking at the creature with sword and blade. Boromir struck with his great shield, driving back the tentacles, while Legolas fired arrows into the murky depths. The monster shrieked and released Frodo, writhing in pain. At the same moment, Gandalf suddenly cried Melon, the elvish word for friend. The doors of Moria groaned and swung open. "Inside! Quickly!" Aragorn shouted. The Fellowship rushed through the entrance as the Watcher lunged once more. Just as Frodo stumbled into the darkness, the creature slammed against the stone, bringing the doors crashing down behind them. They were trapped. Darkness surrounded them, heavy and absolute. The air was thick and stale, untouched by the wind for centuries. Frodo felt his heart pounding. Gandalf struck his staff against the ground, and a small light flared to life. Before them stretched a vast tunnel, leading deep into the blackness. "We now have but one road," Gandalf said. "The road goes ever on." With heavy hearts, the Fellowship took their first steps into the mines of Moria, unaware of the ancient terror that waited in the depths. The heavy stone doors of Moria had sealed shut behind them, leaving the Fellowship in absolute darkness. The air was thick and musty, untouched by wind for centuries. Frodo gripped Sting tightly, the elven blade offering him little comfort in the oppressive silence of the tunnels. The only light came from Gandalf's staff, casting long shadows against the walls. Their journey through the mines had begun. The Fellowship moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the vast underground halls. Moria had once been the greatest of all dwarven kingdoms, home to countless generations of Durin's folk. But now it was a ruin, a tomb. As they advanced, Gimli's excitement was tempered by the growing realization that no living dwarf would greet them here. Balin, his kinsman, had led a company to reclaim Moria years ago, but there had been no word since. Gandalf led the way, navigating through the endless passages with careful deliberation. "I once passed through Moria long ago," he said, his voice low. "But even then, it was perilous. Now we walk blind into its depths." For days, they traveled in darkness, moving through vast halls where the ceilings vanished into shadow. The walls were adorned with dwarven runes and carvings, silent remnants of a lost people. They passed through great stone bridges, spanning deep chasms and stairways leading ever downward. The atmosphere was eerie, and an unseen tension gripped them all. One night, as they rested in a large chamber, Pippin's curiosity got the better of him. He wandered to the edge of a deep well, and before Gandalf could stop him, knocked a loose stone into the abyss. They all froze as the stone clattered down and down, its sound fading into nothingness. A long moment passed. Then, from the darkness below, came an answering sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping. Gandalf's eyes darkened with anger. "Fool of a Took," he snapped. "Throw yourself in next time and rid us of your foolishness." But the tapping continued for some time before finally ceasing. It was impossible to tell what had made the sound. Onward they pressed, and eventually they reached a great chamber, one that struck Gimli with a deep sadness. A tomb stood in the center, the stone carved with ancient dwarvish runes. Gandalf approached and traced the letters with his fingers, reading aloud, "Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria." Gimli let out a quiet gasp, his face grim. The hope of finding Balin's colony alive had vanished. The chamber was littered with the remains of a battle, broken weapons, rusted armor, and the skeletal remains of dwarves. A great book lay near Balin's tomb, its pages torn and blackened with age. Gandalf picked it up and carefully turned the pages. "It is a record of Balin's folk," he said. His voice grew grim as he read further. "They were attacked. Orcs came in great numbers. They fought bravely but were driven back. We cannot get out. The last entry simply says they are coming." Even as Gandalf spoke the words, a chilling sound echoed through the mines. A deep, guttural horn blast, followed by the clatter of armored feet. The orcs had found them. Boromir rushed to the doors and peered out. His face was set with grim determination. "They are many," he said. "Too many." The Fellowship prepared for battle. Aragorn and Boromir stood at the front, swords drawn. Legolas readied his bow. Gimli took his place beside Balin's tomb, gripping his axe tightly. The hobbits, though terrified, brandished their small blades. Then, with a terrible crash, the doors burst open. A swarm of orcs poured into the chamber, their black armor glinting in the dim light. They shrieked as they charged. The battle was fierce and brutal. Aragorn and Boromir struck down orc after orc, their blades flashing. Legolas's arrows flew swift and true, felling enemies before they could reach the others. Gimli fought with the fury of his ancestors, cutting through the creatures with his axe. The hobbits, though outmatched, fought with determination. Sam, standing in front of Frodo, stabbed at an approaching orc, sending it tumbling backward. Frodo himself was knocked to the ground, but he scrambled to his feet and struck back with sting. The battle seemed endless. Then, a great shadow darkened the doorway. A massive cave troll lumbered into the room, its gray skin thick as stone, its eyes small and filled with dull malice. It carried a heavy chain and a massive club. With terrifying strength, it swung its weapon, smashing stone and sending dust into the air. The Fellowship scattered. Legolas loosed an arrow into the troll's hide, but it barely noticed. Aragorn and Boromir attacked its legs, slashing at its tough skin. Gimli roared as he struck at its knees, but the beast only bellowed in rage. The troll suddenly turned its dull gaze to Frodo. With terrifying speed, it lunged. Frodo tried to leap away, but the troll's massive spear struck him in the chest, sending him flying. Time seemed to stop. Frodo lay motionless. Sam let out a cry of horror and rushed to his side. "Frodo, no!" The battle raged around them, but all eyes were on Frodo. Then, impossibly, he stirred. He let out a gasp and slowly sat up. The others stared in disbelief. The spear had struck him, but beneath his tunic, something had stopped it. Gasping, Frodo pulled back his cloak to reveal a shimmering silver shirt mithril, the gift from Bilbo in Rivendell. Gandalf exhaled in relief. "Mithril," he murmured. "You are full of surprises, Master Baggins." Renewed with fury, the Fellowship pressed their attack. Legolas took careful aim and fired a final arrow straight into the troll's throat. The beast let out a choking roar, stumbled, and crashed to the ground. The remaining orcs hesitated. Then, from deep within the tunnels, a new sound arose, a deep, unearthly roar, like fire and thunder given voice. Gandalf's face went pale. He turned to the others, urgency in his eyes. "A Balrog," he whispered. The orcs, hearing the roar, fled in terror, vanishing into the darkness. But the Fellowship had no time to celebrate. The ancient terror of Moria had awakened. Gandalf grabbed his staff and shouted, "Run!" Without hesitation, the Fellowship fled, racing through the halls of Moria as the Balrog's presence grew nearer. It was coming for them, and the mountain trembled in its wake. The deep, echoing roar sent a shudder through the very stone of Moria. Dust trickled from the ceilings as the Fellowship scrambled out of the chamber, leaving behind the wreckage of their battle with the orcs and the troll. The air had grown thick and oppressive, and a sudden, unnatural heat radiated from the depths of the mines. Whatever had made that terrible sound was awake, and it was coming for them. "Run," Gandalf commanded, his voice urgent. There was no hesitation. The company bolted through the dark tunnels, feet pounding against ancient stone. Behind them, a deep, distant drumming began, slow and rhythmic, like a monstrous heartbeat. The Balrog had stirred. Their flight through Moria became a blur of twisting passages and treacherous stairways. They ran through vast halls with towering pillars, their shadows stretching in the dim light of Gandalf's staff. The air grew hotter still, and an orange glow flickered in the depths of distant chasms. Frodo's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, a deep, ancient presence pressing upon his mind, a being of fire and shadow unlike anything he had ever known. They turned a corner and came upon a vast, spiraling stairway carved into the rock. The drop beside it was bottomless, disappearing into blackness. Gandalf barely slowed as he led them onto the narrow path. Quickly, but carefully, he warned. One misstep would send them plummeting into the abyss. Behind them, the drumming quickened. The orcs had recovered from their terror and were now pursuing them with renewed fury. A chorus of guttural cries echoed through the mines, the clatter of iron-shod feet growing ever closer. Arrows whistled through the air. Legolas spun and fired in return, his shots striking true, but there were too many of them. The orcs were closing in. Boromir took the rear, shield raised to protect the hobbits as they stumbled forward. Gimli swung his axe at any creature that dared come too close, his breath coming in heavy gasps. Sam clutched Frodo's arm, keeping him steady as they climbed higher and higher. Then, just as they reached the top of the stair, a section of the stone crumbled beneath their feet. Frodo stumbled with a cry, teetering on the edge. Aragorn lunged and caught him, dragging him to safety as the ancient stair shattered and fell away into darkness. A deep rumble shook the mountain. "There is no way back now," Legolas murmured. They pressed on, running through the high vaults of Moria. At last, they reached a great archway, and beyond it, a final bridge of stone leading to a massive doorway. Faint daylight shone through cracks in the rock. It was the exit. Relief surged through the company, but their respite was short-lived. A new sound filled the halls, deep and resonant, like a wind roaring through a vast cavern. And then, from the depths of the tunnel, it emerged. The Balrog. It was no ordinary foe. It was a being of flame and darkness, a creature of an age long past, birthed in the ancient wars between the Valar and Morgoth. Its form was immense, wreathed in fire and shadow, towering as high as the chamber itself. In one massive, clawed hand, it held a long whip of flame that cracked through the air, illuminating its monstrous silhouette. Its great horns curled upward like a demon of old, and its burning eyes fixed upon the fellowship with dreadful intent. Legolas froze, terror gripping his heart. Even the fearless Boromir faltered. Gimli clenched his axe but did not advance. There was no fighting such a creature. "We must reach the bridge," Gandalf ordered, and they ran. The Balrog advanced with slow, deliberate strides, its molten footsteps shaking the stone beneath them. Flames licked at the walls as its presence burned through the darkness of Moria. Behind it, orcs poured into the chamber, but held back, cowering in the presence of the ancient beast. The Fellowship reached the bridge of Khazad Dûm. It was a narrow span of stone, arching over a vast chasm with no railings, nothing to stop a fall into the abyss. "Cross," Gandalf commanded. Legolas, Boromir, and the hobbits dashed across, barely daring to breathe. Gimli hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the Balrog with hatred before following. Aragorn paused, waiting for Gandalf, unwilling to leave him behind. Gandalf stood firm at the center of the bridge, his staff in one hand, his sword Glamdring in the other. He turned to face the Balrog alone. "You cannot pass," he declared. His voice, steady and commanding, echoed through the chamber. The Balrog halted, as if momentarily uncertain. It raised its flaming whip and cracked it through the air, the force of it sending waves of heat across the bridge. But Gandalf did not move. He raised his staff, and with it, a white light flared. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor," he proclaimed. "You shall not pass." The Balrog let out a deafening roar and advanced onto the bridge. Gandalf struck the ground with his staff. The bridge trembled. Then, with a great, splitting crack, the stone beneath the Balrog's feet gave way. For a moment, it seemed as though the battle was won. The great beast let out a shrieking cry as it plummeted into the abyss, its fiery form dwindling into the darkness. But as it fell, its whip lashed upward. The flaming tendril wrapped around Gandalf's ankle. His eyes widened in shock as he was yanked forward. His fingers scrabbled at the crumbling stone, but the force was too strong. He turned his gaze to the Fellowship, who watched in horror. "Fly, you fools," he shouted. Then he was gone, pulled into the depths of Moria. A stunned silence followed. Frodo gasped, his heart shattering as Gandalf disappeared. Pippin let out a sob. Even Boromir stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Aragorn was the first to recover. "To the exit. Now," he ordered, his voice raw with grief. They stumbled forward, blinded by shock, barely aware of the daylight as they emerged from Moria into the open air. They stood upon the mountainside, the sky bright and wide above them. The weight of the mountain lifted, but Gandalf was gone. Frodo could not move. He felt as though a piece of himself had been left behind in the mines. Sam wiped his face, though whether it was sweat or tears, he could not tell. Merry and Pippin clung to each other, their faces pale. Gimli knelt, pressing a hand to the earth as if mourning something deeper than words could express. Legolas turned away, staring off into the distance, grief plain upon his fair features. Boromir at last broke the silence. "Give them a moment, for pity's sake," he said, his voice heavy. Aragorn closed his eyes, the weight of leadership pressing upon him. Then he turned to the others, his expression resolute. "We must go on," he said. "We cannot stay here." With heavy hearts, the Fellowship gathered themselves and moved forward. The road ahead was uncertain, the weight of their loss settling upon them. But there was no turning back. The quest had to continue, no matter the cost. The Fellowship emerged from the darkness of Moria into the open air. But there was no relief, no sense of victory. The loss of Gandalf weighed upon them all like a heavy stone, pressing down on their hearts as they staggered out onto the rocky slopes of the misty mountains. The cold wind bit at their faces, carrying the scent of pine and open sky, but none of them could find joy in it. Frodo felt as though he had left a piece of himself behind in the abyss, where the Balrog had dragged Gandalf to his doom. Merry and Pippin wept openly, their small shoulders shaking with grief. Sam stood beside Frodo, his face pale and stricken, while Gimli knelt on the ground, gripping the earth as if mourning something far greater than just a lost companion. Even Legolas, ever light of step, seemed subdued, his keen eyes fixed on the horizon. Boromir's normally proud stance was slumped, and Aragorn, though he fought to keep his grief contained, had a tightness in his jaw that betrayed the depth of his sorrow. "We must move," Aragorn said at last, his voice hoarse but firm. "We cannot stay here." Boromir turned to him, his face dark with frustration. "Give them a moment, for pity's sake," he said. Aragorn hesitated, but he knew there was no time for mourning. They were still in danger. Orcs might have followed them from Moria, and worse yet, Saruman's spies were surely searching for them. "Gandalf's last command was for us to go on," he said quietly. "We must honor that." Reluctantly, the others nodded. With heavy steps, they began their descent from the mountains. The landscape before them was a wild land of steep ridges and deep valleys, and beyond it, far in the distance, lay Lothlorien, the fabled realm of the elves. It was their best hope for refuge now. The journey was slow and exhausting. The mountains were treacherous, and grief sapped their strength. The hobbits, especially, struggled to keep pace. Frodo's burden seemed heavier than ever, the ring a weight he could not escape. The wound from Weathertop still ached, a constant reminder of the danger he carried. As the hours passed, they descended into the foothills, where patches of green grass and small streams broke up the harshness of the mountain slopes. It should have been a relief to be back in the world of living things, but an unseen shadow seemed to follow them, a lingering dread that refused to fade. By nightfall, they reached a sheltered hollow and made camp. No one spoke much as they ate a simple meal. The absence of Gandalf was a gaping wound in their small company. Normally, he would have lit his pipe, shared words of wisdom, or offered quiet reassurances. Now, there was only silence. Frodo sat apart from the others, staring into the fire. The ring felt heavier than ever around his neck. He clutched it absently, feeling its pull, its ever-present whisper. The burden was his alone, but in that moment, he had never felt more alone. Sam, noticing his master's troubled expression, moved closer. "Mr. Frodo," he said gently, "you should try to rest." Frodo nodded but did not move. Sleep seemed impossible. The night passed uneasily. They took turns keeping watch, but the air felt thick with unseen eyes. Even Legolas, who needed little rest, seemed on edge. When dawn came, they continued their journey toward the golden woods of Lothlorien. The landscape softened as they descended into the valleys. The trees grew taller, their branches stretching toward the sky in graceful arches. The wind carried a new scent, something fresh and otherworldly. As they moved deeper into the forest, a hush fell over them. There was a presence here, something ancient and watchful. "We are being followed," Legolas said suddenly, his keen eyes scanning the trees. Aragorn nodded. He had sensed it too. But whoever was watching them did not reveal themselves. They pressed on until at last they came to a river, a silver stream flowing through the woods, its waters reflecting the golden light that filtered through the canopy. "The borders of Lothlorien," Legolas whispered in reverence. No sooner had he spoken than figures emerged from the trees. Tall and clad in shimmering gray cloaks, bows in hand, they moved with silent grace. Their leader stepped forward, his fair face unreadable. "Halt," he said in a voice smooth as water. "You enter the realm of the Lady of the Wood." Legolas placed a hand over his heart and bowed slightly. "We seek refuge," he said in Elvish. "We are friends of the elves." The leader studied them for a long moment before his gaze landed on Gimli. His expression darkened. "A dwarf," Gimli straightened, his pride flaring. "Yes, and what of it?" Aragorn quickly stepped forward. "We come in peace," he said. "We have lost our guide, Gandalf the Grey." At this, the elves exchanged glances. Their leader's expression softened slightly. "Come," he said at last. "You will be taken to the Lord and Lady of Lorien." The fellowship followed the elves through the golden woods. The air here was different, lighter, yet filled with an ancient power. Time itself seemed to slow, the world softened by an ethereal glow. At last, they came to a great city among the trees. The fabled Cara's Galadhin, where the elves lived high among the branches in graceful platforms of white and gold. Lights glowed softly through the foliage, casting the entire city in a dreamlike radiance. And at the highest platform, in a chamber open to the night sky, the fellowship stood before the rulers of Lothlorien, Lord Celeborn, tall and regal, and beside him, the Lady Galadriel, whose presence was unlike anything they had ever known. She was more than beautiful, she was luminous, ageless, her very being radiating wisdom and power. Her gaze fell upon each of them in turn, and though she spoke no words, it felt as though she saw into their very hearts. When her eyes rested on Frodo, he felt as though she knew everything, his burden, his fears, the weight of the ring. Celeborn spoke first, welcoming them with kindness, though his voice carried sorrow when he learned of Gandalf's fate. "He was a great friend to our people," he said solemnly. Galadriel, however, remained silent for a long time. Then she turned her gaze fully upon Frodo. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but carried the weight of ages. "Your quest is known to me, ring-bearer," she said, "and I see much that lies ahead of you." Frodo shuddered. He felt the ring grow heavy against his chest, as though it resisted her presence. Galadriel turned to the others. "Each of you stands upon the edge of great choices. The road ahead will test you beyond measure." Her gaze lingered on Boromir, and he shifted uncomfortably under her piercing stare. The Fellowship was given rest and shelter in Lothlorien, but none of them could shake the feeling that their time here was but a brief respite before the storm. Each of them, in their own way, would face their deepest fears before this journey was over. And Frodo, above all, knew that the weight of his burden had only just begun. The golden woods of Lothlorien held an enchantment unlike anything the Fellowship had ever known. Time itself seemed to move differently here, stretching and folding like a dream, and the weight of their burdens, though not forgotten, felt momentarily softened by the hush of the trees. The grief of Gandalf's loss lingered, but in the presence of the Lady Galadriel, something stirred within them, a sense of awe, of ancient power, and of something deeper that none could quite name. They were given rest in the great elven city of Cara's Galadhin, high among the trees. The air was filled with music that seemed to come from nowhere, yet carried on the breeze like whispers of an age long past. The elves did not speak often, but their watchful eyes held kindness, and though there was sorrow in their songs, there was also wisdom beyond mortal years. On their second night in Lothlorien, Galadriel called Frodo and Sam to her garden. It was a secluded place, surrounded by white-barked trees whose golden leaves shimmered in the starlight. At its center stood a silver basin filled with water that reflected the light of the stars. "This is the mirror of Galadriel," she said, her voice smooth as flowing water. "I can command it to reveal many things, some that were, some that are, and some that yet may be." She gestured for Frodo to approach. "Will you look?" Frodo hesitated, but something in Galadriel's gaze urged him forward. He stepped toward the basin and peered into the water. At first, he saw only ripples, but then images began to take shape, strange, shifting, and vivid. He saw lands far away, forests darkened with shadow, and battles yet to be fought. He saw the Shire his home, yet it was not as he had left it. The fields were barren, the trees cut down, and hobbits toiled under the rule of men with whips. He gasped, stepping back in horror. "This is but one possible future," Galadriel said gently. "It is not yet set." Sam, who had been watching nervously, swallowed hard. "That won't happen, will it?" he asked. Galadriel did not answer. Instead, she turned to Frodo. "I know what it is you carry," she said softly. "I know its weight, and I know your fear." Frodo's fingers brushed against the ring at his neck. He did not need to speak, she already understood. Then, to his shock, Galadriel lifted her hand, and upon it gleamed a ring of her own, a great elven ring, set with a white stone that shimmered with an inner light. "This is Nenya, one of the three," she said. "The One Ring has power over it, as it does over all things in Middle-earth. Should you succeed in your quest, my power will fade, and Lothlorien will diminish. Yet I do not ask you to turn aside." Frodo's breath caught in his throat as a sudden thought came to him. "If you wish it," he said slowly, "you could take the ring." He pulled the chain from his neck and held the ring out toward her. "You are strong, Lady Galadriel. You could use it for good." For a long moment, Galadriel did not move. Then she smiled, though it was a sad and knowing smile. "I do not deny that my heart has desired it," she admitted. "For many long years, I have pondered what might be if I took the ring. With it, I could wield great power. I would make the world beautiful and terrible, free and enslaved. All would love me in despair." As she spoke, a great change came over her. She seemed to grow taller, and a light surrounded her, brilliant and fearsome. The stars above seemed to dim as her radiance filled the garden. Frodo trembled as he saw what she might become, a queen great and terrible, stronger than the foundations of the earth. But then, just as suddenly, the light faded. She exhaled and let her hands drop to her sides. "I have passed the test," she whispered. "I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." Frodo's hands closed around the ring once more. He understood then that no one, not even the greatest among them, could wield it without being changed. The burden was his alone. The days in Lothlorien passed swiftly, though none could say how long they had stayed. At last, the time came to depart. The Fellowship was given boats, provisions, and gifts from the elves. Galadriel herself bestowed parting gifts to each of them. To Aragorn, she gave a sheath for his sword and the elfstone of Elessar. To Legolas, a bow of the Galadrim, longer and stronger than those of Mirkwood. To Merry and Pippin, silver belts with golden clasps. To Sam, she gave a small wooden box filled with elven soil, a gift he did not yet understand, but would one day treasure above all others. But it was to Frodo that she gave the most precious gift of all, a small crystal vial, filled with the light of Eärendil's star. "May it be a light for you in dark places," she said, "when all other lights go out." Boromir received no special gift, save for a piercing look from Galadriel that left him troubled and uneasy. The doubts in his heart were growing. At last, they set out down the great river Anduin, their boats gliding swiftly with the current. The golden woods of Lothlorien faded behind them, and before them stretched the uncertain road ahead. The river carried them toward the south, where danger awaited. Tension grew as they neared the falls of Rauros. They would soon have to decide their path, whether to go east to Mordor or west to Minas Tirith. Boromir, whose unease had only deepened, grew restless. He watched Frodo carefully, his thoughts clouded by the desire to claim the ring for Gondor. As the Fellowship made camp in the woods of Amon Hen, the final breaking of the company was at hand. Frodo wandered alone, seeking clarity, and Boromir followed. At last, his doubts and desires overwhelmed him, and he confronted Frodo, trying to convince him to bring the ring to Gondor. When words failed, his desperation took hold, and he reached for the ring. "Give it to me," he cried, his voice wild. Frodo recoiled, fear filling his heart. "No," Boromir lunged, but Frodo, in his terror, slipped the ring onto his finger and vanished. Boromir stumbled back, realization dawning in his eyes. He had succumbed to the very temptation he had sworn to resist. Frodo fled, running blindly up the slopes of Amon Hen. The eye of Sauron searched for him, and he felt its terrible gaze drawing closer. With great effort, he pulled the ring from his finger, gasping for breath. He knew then what he had to do. He could not take the others with him. The fellowship was broken. This burden was his alone. At the shore, Sam realized what Frodo was planning. He would not let his master go alone. "I made a promise, Mr. Frodo," he said, diving into the river after him. "Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee. And I don't mean to." Frodo, overwhelmed with emotion, pulled him into the boat. Together they turned toward the eastern shore, toward Mordor. And so the fellowship came to an end. Boromir, racked with guilt, sought redemption, but his fate was sealed. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli would set out in pursuit of the captured Merry and Pippin. And Frodo and Sam, alone in the vastness of Middle-earth, began their long road toward Mount Doom. Thus ended the Fellowship of the Ring, a story of friendship, loss, and the burden of an impossible task. Yet it was only the beginning. The journey of the ring-bearer and the fate of Middle-earth had only just begun.